The paper slid across the table toward me, and with it a voice cold enough to bite. Stay quiet. Sign here. It wasn't a request. It was a command dressed as advice. They even smiled when they said it, as if I should be grateful. Grateful for the chance to erase myself quietly. Grateful for the privilege of vanishing without making waves. They called it a path to peace. But peace isn't peace when it's bought with silence. I hadn't broken anything. I hadn't stolen, cheated, or lied. What I had done, what they could never forgive, was refuse to look away. I saw what they didn't want seen. I named what they didn't want named. And the truth? Well, the truth is expensive. The paper was simple enough. 2 sentences that stripped me of any right to speak about internal matters. No dates, no context, no room for exceptions. My name would sit under theirs, binding me not to conscience, not to honesty, but to their comfort. Sign here, the man repeated, tapping the empty line with a manicured finger. His watch caught the light, and for some reason I noticed it was 10 minutes fast. Maybe that's how people like him live, always trying to get ahead of the moment before it catches them. I kept my hands in my lap. He thought I was hesitating because of pride. He didn't realize it was because I could still hear the voices from last week. Whispers in the hallways, half-closed doors, numbers on reports that didn't add up. The same voices that had told me, it's not worth the trouble. Just let it go. But letting go meant letting them win. I leaned back in my chair, eyes still on the paper. They had made me small for months, cutting my time in meetings, editing my words out of minutes, pretending not to hear me when I spoke. This was supposed to be the final cut, the official burial. I didn't sign, not then, not in front of them, because in that moment I realized something. They were afraid of my voice, but they were terrified of my proof. And proof doesn't need to shout. It just needs the right moment to be read aloud. Let me pause here for just a moment, friends. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Has anything like this ever happened to you? A moment when someone tried to silence you, to make you small, to keep the truth hidden? If this story resonates with you, please subscribe, like, and share it with others. That's how you help us grow this channel and keep bringing you stories that matter. All right, let's continue. The first time it happened, I thought it was a mistake. The conference room looked the same as always, long, polished table, filtered light from the glass wall, coffee carafe steaming at one end. But my chair was gone, not pushed to the side, not tucked under the wrong place setting, gone. In its place sat a stranger from Strategic Communications, shuffling papers and smiling politely as I entered. No one looked at me for more than a second. Eyes stayed fixed on screens, on notepads, on anything but the fact that I was standing there without a seat. Someone said, "We're at capacity today. Sorry." They gestured vaguely toward the back where a narrow strip of wall waited, a place for observers. I'd been an observer once, decades ago, before I'd built the systems they were now discussing, before my name was printed on the very policies they were twisting. The meeting began without me. My department's updates were read by someone else. My data summarized into sound bites so clean they were almost lies. Questions came, answers followed, and the conversation moved forward as if my work had never passed through my hands at all. The second time it happened, I didn't even enter the room. I stood outside the glass wall, listening to the muffled rhythm of voices. You learn a lot when you listen from the outside. The cadence of avoidance, the pregnant pauses where truth should be. The way people look at each other when they think no one is watching. Through the glass, I could see my reports projected on the screen, graphs I'd made, words I'd written. Only now they had new authors, names I'd never seen attached to this work before. It was strange, watching my own sentences roll out of someone else's mouth, scrubbed clean of the parts that mattered. After a while, I stopped pretending I was supposed to be there. I would wait in the hallway, back against the wall, eyes closed, letting their voices spill under the door. They didn't know that every time they cut my chair from the table, they gave me a clearer view of the game they were playing. I was learning the rhythm of exclusion, the deliberate way they made you invisible before they made you irrelevant. But invisibility is dangerous for the wrong people. Because when they think you're gone, they stop hiding. And I was still there, listening, remembering, waiting. It started small, just a missing footnote here, a rounded number there. At first I thought maybe it was formatting, a rushed edit, some intern trying to make the report look cleaner. But then I saw the pattern. Every change cut in the same direction, away from the truth. My warnings about budget overruns became minor adjustments. Safety concerns were rewritten as non-critical observations. Entire paragraphs vanished, the ones with dates and figures that could be checked. And the mistakes, those were left in bold, as if to draw the eye toward a false comfort. When I asked about it, I got the same response, always in the same practiced tone. Don't dramatize. It wasn't fear of being wrong that guided their hands. It was fear of being right, because right would mean action, and action would cost money. And money was the only language they truly spoke. I stopped sending edits through the official channels. Instead, I began keeping 2 copies of every document, one for them, one for me. Mine were marked in red ink, every change logged with the precision of a surveyor. Dates, times, version numbers, attachments, proof stitched together line by line. This wasn't paranoia, this was survival. Late at night, I'd sit at my kitchen table under the hum of a single lamp, flipping through pages that no one wanted to see. I thought about the people who'd be affected if those minor adjustments stayed uncorrected. The workers who'd trust faulty numbers. The families who'd trust unsafe walls. The official reports painted a smooth picture. My copies told a jagged story. That second journal became more than just a backup. It became a ledger. One for the court, if it ever came to that, and one for my own conscience, so I could sleep, knowing that somewhere the truth still existed in black and red. They thought the red pen made me dangerous. What they didn't know was that it also made me patient. It was the way they still smiled at me in the hallway that stung the most. The casual nods, the light, "How's the family?" As if the walls didn't have ears. As if the votes they'd cast in closed sessions weren't already written into the minutes. Betrayal, I learned, is rarely a public spectacle. It's quieter, cleaner. It's a hand on your shoulder in the break room, warm and familiar, followed by a pen signing against you in the boardroom. I'd watch them gather before meetings, leaning in close, voices low. A laugh here, a murmur there, the quick glances in my direction before turning back to their tight little circle. It wasn't hostility, it was convenience. Supporting me was messy. Supporting them was easy. The first time I read my name in the voting record under "opposed by unanimous decision," I traced each signature like a fingerprint. Some belonged to people I'd mentored years ago, people whose first paychecks I'd approved, whose mistakes I'd shielded from consequences. Now they were aligning themselves with the tide, and the tide was moving away from me. It wasn't even malice. That's what made it worse. Malice you can fight, you can face it, name it, strike back. But this was something else, self-preservation. They were protecting their own positions, their own paychecks, their own sense of belonging in a room that demanded loyalty to the loudest voices, not the truest ones. In the corridors, they'd still lower their voices to say, "I know you're right." In emails, they'd still write, "Let's talk offline." But when it came time to stand, they sat. When it came time to speak, they swallowed their words. And I understood then that betrayal doesn't need to shout to be fatal. It seeps in through the gaps between trust and necessity. It hides in polite smiles and well-rehearsed nods. It thrives not on hatred, but on comfort. I stopped expecting allies, because allies in whispers are only friends until the vote is called. The archives were never busy. A dim, climate-controlled room tucked beneath the main building. It smelled faintly of paper and dust, the scent of things people no longer cared to remember. That's where I went when I needed silence, and lately, silence was the only place I could still think. The files were arranged in neat rows, their order more ceremonial than practical. Most of the binders hadn't been opened in years. Some still had the brittle, yellowed strings holding their pages together. I ran my fingers along the spines until I found the set I was looking for. Original contracts, foundational agreements, the kind of documents most people skim once and then bury under decades of revisions. I carried the binder to a table. the leather cover cracking slightly as it opened. My eyes scanned familiar paragraphs, clauses about board structure, voting thresholds, procedural obligations. All of it as dry as sand, until my gaze caught on one line. It was short, almost insignificant, tucked between two sections no one would bother to read, unless they had a reason. A single sentence, no more than 15 words, written in the kind of precise legal language that doesn't leave room for interpretation. It turned recommendations into mandatory actions, not suggestions, not guidelines. Orders, backed by signatures from every board member, past and present. I read it twice, then 3 times, my pulse slowing into a steady, deliberate beat. It was like finding a single live wire in a wall everyone else thought was dead. They had been operating as if this clause didn't exist, ignoring it in every vote, every non-binding report they had dismissed, without consequence. But here it was, black ink on white paper, something no amount of spin could erase. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of it. This wasn't just a detail. This was leverage. It meant that all the red pen notes they'd buried, all the warnings they'd watered down, weren't just moral failures. They were contractual violations. And they had signed it, all of them. Year after year, renewal after renewal, without ever bothering to read past the first page. They wanted me to stay quiet, but the thing about archives is, they don't forget, and neither do I. It started with the phone calls. Always late. Too late to be casual, too early to pretend they'd simply forgotten the time. The first one came on a Tuesday, 10:43 p.m. My phone lit up in the dark kitchen where I was rinsing dishes, and I remember thinking it had to be an emergency. No one calls at that hour unless something's wrong. The voice on the other end was polite. Polite in the way a hand on your back can be, guiding you somewhere you don't want to go. "Just checking in," they said. "We want to make sure you're okay." There was a pause, almost a breath too long, before the words softened into something more deliberate. "We think it would be better for everyone if you just stayed in your lane." The second call came 2 nights later. This time the tone was lighter, almost joking. "You know, you've always been a valuable part of the team," they said. "It'd be a shame if, well, you know." And I did know. I knew exactly what they weren't saying. In daylight, the tactics shifted. They never came at me directly in front of a crowd. No raised voices, no official memos. It was all done in doorways, stairwells, quiet corners of the parking garage. People I'd mentored, people whose names I'd once vouched for, would pull me aside. Their eyes darted around before they spoke. "Look, I'm telling you this as a friend. Ease up. You're making waves. This isn't the hill you want to die on." Sometimes they didn't use words at all. They'd let my calls go unanswered for days, forget to copy me on critical emails, schedule meetings at times they knew I couldn't attend. One morning I found my access badge didn't open the conference room door. They called it a technical glitch. It wasn't. Even the friendly ones carried a message. A coffee slipped onto my desk with a quiet, "Just think about your family." A pat on the shoulder followed by, "Some fights aren't worth it." That was the worst part. The implication that the truth was somehow optional. A luxury I could set down like an old coat if I decided it was too heavy to wear. And there were the after-hours gatherings. The ones where the important discussions happened in laughter over whiskey, where alliances were formed between people whose hands had never touched the kind of work I did. I was never invited, but I always heard about them. They made sure I did. Fear was their currency, but they didn't spend it in lump sums. They paid it out in small doses, late-night interruptions, half-phrases, missing chairs, closed doors, enough to keep me off balance, enough to make me wonder, just for a moment, if maybe I was the one being unreasonable. But I'd lived long enough to know what fear disguised as advice sounds like. I'd heard it before, in other rooms from other mouths, when the stakes were different but the tactics the same. The truth is, they weren't trying to convince me I was wrong. They were trying to convince me I was alone. And the thing about being alone, it leaves you free to act without asking permission. There comes a point when you stop answering the phone, when the late-night friendly advice calls lose their novelty, when the carefully constructed silences in meetings stop feeling like a wound and start feeling like a dare. That was where I found myself, past the point of hoping they'd do the right thing. far beyond the illusion that reasoned conversation could turn a rotting structure straight again. I didn't want a scene. I'd seen enough people go down in flames because they mistook volume for power. Shouting only gave them something to dismiss. Anger made it easy for them to change the subject. And I wasn't going to give them that escape. So I chose paper. Not a press conference, not a leak, not some desperate post on a social feed that would be buried in an hour. Paper is patient. Paper can't be interrupted. Paper doesn't roll its eyes or check its watch while you speak. The decision came one night as I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where my father used to do the household bills, with a stub of a pencil and an old calculator. In front of me, my second journal, the one with the red ink notes, stacks of printed reports, each marked in my handwriting, emails I'd saved, some almost laughably damning in their casual arrogance, signatures under policy clauses they pretended didn't exist. I opened a fresh legal pad. At the top of the page, I wrote the first fact. No commentary, no adjectives, just the date, the action, the names involved. Then the next fact, and the next. Slowly, methodically, I began to build the kind of structure they couldn't knock over with a shrug. Each entry was a brick, each document a beam. I wasn't just writing a letter. I was building a bridge from what they claimed to what I could prove. I didn't stop to think about tone or style. This wasn't about persuasion. This was about evidence. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. The pressure, the whispered betrayals, the careful erasures, they'd all been meant to make me reactive, but now, with every word I put down, I was becoming the opposite. I wasn't reacting, I was recording. I knew exactly where the letter would go. Who would read it first? Whose faces would tighten when they saw their own signatures staring back at them from the page? It wouldn't be dramatic. No grand reveal in a crowded room. Just a single envelope, heavy with truth, landing on the desk of someone who still remembered the difference between procedure and law. They told me to stay quiet, and I would until the paper spoke for me. The first draft was too sharp. I knew it as soon as I read it back to myself. It carried the residue of anger, and anger is easy to dismiss. They would skim it, label me emotional, and toss it aside. No, this had to be cold, clean, unshakable. So I started again. The second draft was too soft. Facts without force can sound like suggestions, and suggestions are easy to ignore. They needed to feel the weight of each sentence, the finality of it. By the time I reached the fifth draft, the clock had long since passed midnight. The house was silent except for the slow hum of the refrigerator in the next room. My coffee had gone cold, but I didn't notice. I was chasing precision. Each line had to lock into the next like steel plates bolted under pressure. I wrote with the patience of an engineer, knowing that one loose word could give them room to wriggle free. Every number I included had to be traceable, not from memory, but from documents they themselves had signed. Dates, amounts, clause numbers, cross-referenced with the original contracts. 15 drafts, 7 separate rounds of checking figures, each calculation verified twice, then checked again in the quiet hours when the mind is too tired for ego but sharp enough for truth. I pulled language straight from their own reports, their own meeting minutes, stripping it of excuses and leaving it bare. I cited the page and paragraph for every claim, not because I doubted myself, but because I wanted them to doubt their ability to escape it. On the desk beside me, a small stack of contracts sat open, each tagged with a yellow note pointing to a line they had conveniently forgotten. I copied those lines word for word into the letter, my pen pressing so hard into the paper it left grooves. By 3 a.m., my eyes burned from the strain, but I kept going. Precision became a kind of prayer. I wasn't just writing, I was tightening every bolt, welding every seam, until the structure of the letter could bear the weight of their denials without bending. I wanted them to feel it when they read it, the inevitability. Like watching a bridge rise from the river, each beam already locked into place before they even realized the design. When I finally leaned back in my chair, the letter sat there in front of me, not as an argument, but as an artifact, unmoving, complete. I didn't need to add a single threat. The truth was heavy enough. It didn't look like much, just a plain manila envelope, the kind that disappears into office mailrooms every day without anyone noticing. But this one was heavier than it should have been, not just from the weight of the paper inside, but from the weight of what it carried. On the front, in black ink, I wrote the name of the committee, not "to whom it may concern," not a generic title. Specific people, people whose signatures were already scattered across the documents inside. I wanted them to feel that first moment of recognition, that instinctive tightening in the chest when you see your own name tied to something you can't ignore. Beneath that, in smaller letters, internal review, external audit, personal accountability, 3 lines, 3 destinations. The kind of destinations that once reached cannot be backtracked from without someone noticing. I sealed the flap slowly, running my fingers along the edge as if I were closing a wound. I didn't use staples. I didn't trust them. I used reinforced tape, pressing it down until it fused with the paper. This wasn't going to be the kind of envelope that accidentally came open before it reached the right hands. But one copy wasn't enough. Copies were my insurance. One to the committee chair, one to the external auditing firm we were contracted with, the kind that took pride in uncovering skeletons others pretended not to see, and a third, sent to someone outside the chain of command entirely. Someone who, by their position and obligations, could not afford to not know. Someone who understood that turning a blind eye was just another form of guilt. Each envelope bore the same calm handwriting. No accusations, no grand warnings, just the steady assurance of a man who had decided the truth was going to stand, whether anyone liked it or not. I placed them in my bag with deliberate care. They didn't rattle, they didn't bend. They sat solidly like bricks ready to be laid into place. Walking into the morning air with those envelopes in my possession, I realized I felt lighter. Not because the fight was over, but because the words were no longer trapped inside me. They had form now, they had a spine. And once a truth has a spine, it can stand in any room. The email arrived with no subject line, just a single line in the body. Your presence is required, 9 a.m. conference room 4. No explanation, no agenda, the kind of summons you don't decline because the absence would be used as proof of something they hadn't even accused you of yet. When I walked into the room, the first thing I noticed was the table. Long enough that the people at either end looked like they were in different worlds. It was the kind of table designed to make you feel small, no matter where you sat. And that was the point. The faces around it were carved from stone. No smiles, no nods of recognition, just the flat, unreadable expressions of people who had already decided which way this was going to go. In front of the chair at the head of the table sat a small black recorder, its red light blinking in steady rhythm, like the ticking of a clock you couldn't hear but could feel. They didn't offer me water. They didn't offer me a seat at first, either. I stood for a moment longer than necessary, letting the silence stretch, before they gestured, 2 fingers, curt, toward the lone chair placed slightly off-center from the rest. Not quite part of the table, not quite separate from it. The kind of placement that says, "You're here, but you're not one of us." I sat down slowly. No papers in front of me, no laptop, no binder filled with exhibits to flip through theatrically. Just one thing, the letter. The same letter that had traveled in a sealed envelope, its words now folded neatly into a single, deliberate packet. The chair at the head leaned forward, fingers laced together. "We have some questions." The voice was calm, but the calm of a blade before it cuts. I didn't respond. Not yet. I let the silence sit between us, filling the space until it became something they had to step into. One by one, they began. "Do you have any additional context to provide? Were you aware of the implications of these statements? Would you like to elaborate before this proceeds further?" I kept my hands folded over the letter, my eyes steady. Every question was an invitation to wander into their framing, to let them turn my facts into opinions they could debate. But I hadn't come to debate. I'd come to put the truth in the center of the table and let it speak for itself. When I finally did move, it was only to slide the letter forward, across the polished surface, until it came to rest in front of the recorder. My fingers left it clean, my voice absent. They had wanted me here to explain. But explanations can be twisted, reworded, minimized. Paper, though. Paper holds its shape. So I gave them nothing but the letter, and the silence that came with it. The chair at the head of the table unfolded the letter like it was any other document, like it didn't have the power to alter the air in the room. At first the voice was smooth, measured, almost rehearsed. The kind of tone people use when they think they already know the ending. But the ending wasn't theirs. The first line landed clean, factual, without ornament. A date, a meeting, a documented decision. I watched it register on faces around the table, slight twitches at the corners of mouths, eyes dropping briefly to the tabletop before snapping back to neutral. By the second page, the rhythm had changed. The chair slowed, if only to make sure the words were being pronounced correctly. But in doing so, they gave each fact its own weight. Each clause was a hammer. Each number a weight dropped from a height. The figures weren't abstract. They were tied to signatures, their signatures. Page after page, the letter became less something being read aloud and more something being revealed. You could hear the shift in the room. The shuffling of papers stopped. The sound of pen tips clicking in and out stopped. Even the steady blink of the recorder's red light seemed louder. One paragraph in particular hit like a dropped wrench, the section quoting the safety clause they had all initialed and then ignored. The voice reading it faltered just enough to notice. They glanced up at me, then back down, as if making eye contact might acknowledge something they weren't ready to admit. From that point on, the sentences dragged. Not because the letter was long, but because each line landed with the kind of finality that leaves no space for rebuttal. Facts have a way of doing that. They don't need to raise their voice to be heard. When they reached the page with the direct comparison, the timeline matched against the budget cuts, the missing inspections set beside the accelerated deadlines, the reading stopped altogether. For a few seconds, the only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning, and then, without a word, the chair cleared their throat and continued. But the confidence was gone. The voice had thinned, each word handled like it might burn on contact. By the time the last page was read, the letter lay flat on the table between us like a piece of evidence in a trial that had already been decided. No one moved to pick it up again. No one dared call it opinion. It was no longer my letter, it was the letter, and now it belonged to the room. When the last word of the letter fell into the room, it didn't echo. It settled, like dust after a building comes down. No one reached for the papers. No one even shifted in their seats right away. It was as if the act of moving might draw attention to themselves, might make the silence look directly at them. I could feel it. The temperature change. Not colder, not warmer, but heavier. The kind of air you feel in your chest before you breathe it in. Someone at the far end of the table slid their glass of water a few inches away, as if suddenly aware of the sound it might make if it tipped. Another person, halfway down the row, reached into their pocket, pulled out a phone, and then turned it off without looking at the screen. The silence wasn't absence. It was presence. It was truth filling every corner, every space between us, every pocket of air that used to belong to easy lies and safe phrases. You could tell it unnerved them, not because they didn't know the facts before, but because now those facts had shape, voice, and audience. I sat still. I'd learned long ago that the moment after the truth is spoken is the most dangerous time to make noise. People scramble for footholds in that moment, desperate to grab at anything that might restore their balance. If you speak too soon, you give them something to hold on to. If you stay silent, they have to sit in the fall. One of them, a man who had avoided looking at me since the meeting began, shifted in his seat, pushing his chair back just an inch. The scrape of the leg against the floor was jarring in the stillness, like the crack of a branch in a forest. He froze, realizing all eyes had turned on him without anyone intending to. Across from me, someone reached for a pen, twirling it between their fingers, then setting it back down without writing a word. I could almost hear their thoughts. If I write, it's recorded. If I speak, it's recorded. But if I do nothing, maybe I'm invisible. Didn't work. Not here. Not with the letter lying in the center of the table like a live wire, daring anyone to touch it. For a long, suspended moment, no one spoke. No one coughed. No one even cleared their throat. It wasn't respect. It was something sharper. The truth had claimed all the oxygen, and no one in that room knew how to breathe around it yet. The pages lay flat, but the weight of them was anything but. Each line was anchored by a name, not mine, theirs. Signatures scrawled in ink that had long since dried, but still carried the heat of the moment they were made. Dates printed in the corner like silent witnesses, unblinking. Approval stamps pressed down with the confidence of people who never imagined those marks would be read out loud in a room like this. It struck me again. This wasn't my accusation. I hadn't needed to invent a single sentence. Everything in that letter had come from them. Their memos, their minutes, their own clipped email replies sent late at night to avoid questions. I had simply gathered the fragments they'd left behind like footprints in wet cement. No one tried to argue with the words. They didn't dare. You can argue with a person, twist their tone, dismiss their motives, but a scanned document bearing your own signature, that's not an opinion. That's a mirror. And mirrors don't take sides. They just reflect. One man kept his gaze fixed on the tabletop, his jaw shifting like he was grinding invisible stones between his teeth. Another adjusted her blazer again and again, as though a straighter seam could straighten the story. The youngest at the table kept glancing toward the door, calculating the distance, maybe wondering if leaving now would make them look like a coward or just smart. The truth was etched into the page in black and white, but it lived in the silence between us now. I could almost hear the sound of their thoughts scraping against the inside of their skulls, searching for a way to deny what was already undeniable. And that was the beauty of it. I didn't need to push. I didn't need to raise my voice or lean forward or punctuate anything with a finger against the table. The proof was theirs, and so was the shame that came with it. I had only done the simplest thing a person can do. I'd held up their own words and let them read themselves. It started without ceremony. No roll call, no formal motion from the floor, just a single sentence from the chair, spoken with a voice stripped of its earlier smoothness. We need to consider immediate corrective measures. The words hung there for a moment before someone else picked them up and began shaping them into action. Temporary suspension, another voice added, cautious at first, but firmer with each syllable. Then another, independent audit. A third, quieter, but with a certain finality, full reimbursement where funds were misallocated. And finally, almost reluctantly, we'll have to notify the regulator. Each phrase landed like the click of a lock, sliding into place. They didn't look at me when they said them. They didn't have to. This wasn't about me anymore. The letter had shifted the weight in the room, and now they were moving because the floor beneath them had tilted. Some of them looked pale, their eyes glassy with the dawning realization that the very system they'd used to shield themselves was now turning inward, the machinery grinding in their direction. One man fiddled with his watch strap, tightening it again and again until the skin beneath it flushed red. Another flipped her legal pad over as if starting a new page might erase the one she'd already filled with names and consequences. The vote wasn't called in the formal sense, no hands raised high, no recorded tally. It happened the way certain decisions happen in rooms like this, through murmured assent, the absence of protest, the unspoken agreement that this was the only way forward. And just like that, the list of forced measures was real. Suspensions, an audit team with no ties to the board, a process for returning funds, quietly, if possible, and the unavoidable truth, a letter to the regulator, one that would carry the same dates, signatures, and clauses they had all just heard read aloud. Justice didn't arrive with a cheer. There was no applause, no moment of cinematic triumph. It came in the form of clipped sentences and nods that no one wanted to make, the kind of reluctant consensus that meant people were already thinking about damage control. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't meant to be, but it was clear. And in matters like this, clarity is the sharpest form of justice there is. They had told me to stay quiet, to shrink my presence, to sign where they pointed, to let the tide of their version of events wash over mine until there was nothing left to stand on. And for a long time, I did stay quiet, not because I agreed, but because I understood something they didn't. Silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's the chamber where truth waits until the moment it will echo the loudest. That moment had come. And it hadn't been my voice that filled the room. It had been the letter. Page after page, it had done what I couldn't do without being interrupted. It didn't flinch, didn't soften its edges to make anyone more comfortable. It carried the weight of dates and names and signatures like stones in its pockets, and it dropped each one into the center of the table until the ripples reached every corner. When the last word was spoken, there was no applause, no handshake, no grand acknowledgement. The air simply shifted, and decisions began to take form, not because I'd convinced anyone, but because the truth had left them nowhere else to stand. Suspensions, audits, repayments, formal notifications. They came in clipped, reluctant sentences, but they came. I didn't linger to watch the aftermath. Those conversations would stretch on without me, pulled into the long machinery of procedures and press statements. I had no interest in seeing them try to reclaim their dignity with carefully chosen words. I gathered my coat slowly, feeling the grain of the wood beneath my fingertips as I stood. My chair made the smallest sound as I pushed it back. Not defiance, not apology, just the quiet scrape of something being returned to its place. No one stopped me. No one met my eyes. In the hallway, the air felt different, lighter, though the building hadn't changed. I passed people who didn't know what had just happened behind those closed doors. They carried on with their mornings, typing, answering phones, smiling in ways that had nothing to do with boardrooms or clauses. And it struck me. Most victories don't need an audience. I stepped outside into the cold. The city moved around me in its usual rhythm, oblivious. Cars in motion, crosswalk lights changing. A gust of wind that pulled at the edges of the letter still folded in my pocket. The copy I'd kept for myself. They had told me to stay quiet, and I had. But I had also made sure that the truth was written in ink thick enough to speak on its own. When I left that room, I wasn't a loud hero, bathed in the glow of recognition. I was something harder to see, but harder to erase, a man who had given words back their weight. And once words have their weight again, no one in that room will ever be able to pretend they're just air.